music my dad would love. All right. All right. Good morning, Buju, Minogijip. I know we're here in the homelands of the Mdewakanton Dakota people, but I have to greet you in our language, and I'm very grateful for the Shakopee tribe to be hosting us today. I want to also thank the team here at NCAI. Let's give them a round of applause. These are always really hard to pull together. I always enjoy coming to these events. You know that sometimes people don't necessarily like going out into the firing line with questions and whatnot, but I really enjoy coming here because both myself and our team, we learn a lot from all of you when we come to these events and learn about your communities, but also what you're doing to solve problems in your communities and on the ground. I've had the privilege of serving in this role now for 2.5 years. It's like dog years, so that's why I've got a lot more gray hair now than when I started. I've had a chance to visit many of you in your communities. I've also had the chance to meet with many of you back in our office in Washington, D.C., and at events like this. And I know others on our team in the Asia office and Indian Affairs have had a chance. We've been doing a lot of travel over these last 2.5 years, and I've been out in many of your communities. And you guys, as tribal leaders, have a tough job. It's every bit as demanding as any other leadership position at any level of government in this country. We know that, and we've seen it in our visits to your communities. We've seen the incredible work that many of you are doing with the historic levels of funding that have come down from the federal government under President Biden's administration over the past 2.5 years, along with the growth in 105L tribal leases that you've signed with us in that time. There are so many good things that are happening across Indian country. And so I want to just start briefly with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. You've heard from all of us in the administration say it, but it's always worth repeating because these two laws, they represent the largest investment in climate resilience in the history of our country. They also support and empower tribes to face environmental impacts to your homelands, to your cultural resources, and to your lives. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law alone invests more than $13 billion directly into Indian country. Now, I know, again, you've heard this from us lots of times, but think about that. Those of you who've been serving in leadership long enough to get rocking to that intro song that we came out to, know that, talking about $13 billion in funding in Indian country is like, it's something that would have been a pipe dream to a lot of us years ago. And that's just the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And within that, the BIA has $466 million for climate resilience. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act adds on top of that another $385 million for climate resilience, drought mitigation, and fisheries rehabilitation. That law, the IRA, also provides $150 million to Indian country through the BIA for a new tribal electrification program. And I have to thank Jennifer and Amber and the folks in Congress for really prioritizing that and making those investments. Many of you know that there's a need for home electrification across Indian country. In 2022, the Department of Energy published a report that stated nearly 17,000 homes across Indian country lack electricity. So we want to make sure that we take that $150 million and maximize the impact of those funds. We are expecting to award funding through a competitive proposal process with an emphasis on need, and we'll provide technical assistance throughout the process and look to move that money through 638 contracts. And we also plan to offer 2-year funding in 2 separate rounds of grants for electrification projects, with half to be obligated by the end of this fiscal year, and all funds we expect to be obligated by the end of fiscal year 2025. Those two laws are also supporting other important work in communities across Indian country. So if you go to our website, if you go on the internet and you search Bureau of Indian Affairs Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, you'll find a map on our website that shows where most of these projects are being supported. And on that map, you'll see projects like a $23 million investment at Pine Ridge for dam rehabilitation, an $8.7 million investment at Hopi for clean drinking water, a $1 million investment at Fort Belknap for rangeland water. You'll also see on that map a $765,000 investment in wildfire mitigation at Northern Arapahoe, and a $250,000 for mercury monitoring up here at Red Lake to the north. And there are so many others. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law also supports President Biden's Internet for All initiative with a $65 billion investment that also includes tribes. And at BIA, our National Broadband Grant Program offers grants and technical assistance to tribes for exploring the possibility of developing or extending broadband services within your communities through feasibility studies and broadband development opportunities. And last month, we awarded $2.7 million in tribal broadband grants to 18 tribes and tribal organizations to provide funding for 2 years. But the bill and the IRA aren't the only way that we're supporting infrastructure improvement across Indian country. Over the last 2 years, we've seen an explosion in the growth of 105L leasing across Indian country. These agreements allow tribes to access funding under Public Law 638 to support things from tribal courts and police headquarters to social services and healthcare. And funding for these things is mandated by Public Law 638. So in order to help tribes access these resources, we've created a step-by-step walkthrough plan to show you how to go through the 105L leasing process. As a result of these efforts, and as a result, frankly, of your efforts in your communities, we've doubled the number of 105L leases in 2022 up to 236 across the country, totaling $42 million in funding for tribal infrastructure. By comparison, in 2020, there were just 6 leases across the country, worth $9 million. And this year, we're expecting to top 300 105L leases across Indian country. And it's been a challenge for us at Interior to keep up with this demand, but it's important that we work with Congress to, through the budget process to make investments that allow us to keep pace with you. And that's why President Biden has proposed to reclassify the 105L lease agreement requirements from discretionary funding to mandatory funding in the FY24 budget request. And we're also working on a lot of policy stuff too. Now, I'm not going to just come up here and read the whole laundry list, but I want to cover some important things. You know, the Indian Reorganization Act is nearly 100 years old. And ever since that law was passed, the Department of the Interior, we've made it harder and harder and harder through regulations and policies and process to put land into trust under the IRA. Prior to being sworn in, President Biden committed to Indian country to make that process faster and simpler for tribes in an effort to restore tribal homelands. And in line with that promise, we've made significant progress over the last 2.5 years of improving the land into trust process. So some of you may remember that during President Obama's administration, the Department of the Interior met its commitment to put 500,000 acres of land into trust over 8 years. Well, since the beginning of 2021, in just over 2 years, we've been able to put more than 265,000 acres of land into trust across Indian country for tribes. Yeah. And that includes parcel of land for the Central Council of Tlingit and Haida in Juneau, a site I visited recently, which is just the second trust acquisition for tribes in Alaska since NCAI was passed. And we're going to continue to process land and trust applications for tribes in Alaska as we go forward. And we're also continuing our work to finalize our updated land and trust regulations by the end of this year. So under President Biden and Secretary Holland, we've been working on a lot. I don't have time here, and frankly, you guys probably don't have time either for us to list out everything that our team's been working on, but it's been a lot. And every day, Secretary Holland reiterates her commitment and also her expectation that we have to live up to our trust responsibility, and that we have to spend every day here with the time that we have working to make life better for people in tribal communities. Her commitment is unwavering and her effort is tireless. And I can assure you that having attended events like this with her and others and walked and exercised with her, her effort really is tireless. It's really hard to keep up with her sometimes. But I know that most of you know this stuff about her and about our team and this commitment. And I know that many of you here in this room have been tracking this work and that you understand the progress that's being made. But in our meetings with you, we also hear from you a sense of urgency. When you meet with us, when you meet with Secretary Holland, when you meet with me and our team, you're carrying the voices of people in your communities. When you talk to us about housing and the need for electricity and internet, you're not just bringing these things up in the abstract. You're thinking of somebody that you know, someone in your community, maybe even a relative who doesn't have electricity or internet. When you talk to us about roads or drinking water, you're thinking of someone that you know. You have somebody in mind when you're speaking these words to us as tribal leaders. Someone in your life who has to drive on a dangerous road just to get to work or to school. Someone in your family whose faucet doesn't run water when they turn it on, if they have even a water line that comes to their house. And when you talk to us about land and trust, you've got someone in your mind. Someone who will be able to move home and live in your community again when you've got land to build tribal housing. Someone who will be able to hunt on that land to feed their family, or pray at a ceremony on that land you want taken into trust. These things aren't abstract. They're personal. And you all have been pushing us with a sense of urgency, not because you don't recognize the work that Secretary Holland and all of our colleagues across the administration have been doing, but because there are people you know and love who are pushing you with that sense of urgency to make life better for them in your community. So you have to push us as tribal leaders. And I appreciate that as a tribal citizen. And our team appreciates that. We all feel that sense of urgency. And it comes from this enormous burden that has been placed on Indigenous people and handed down through generations. It burdens the legacy of colonization and forced assimilation. And it's not just in the past, we feel it today. You feel it today. The people in your communities feel that burden today. It affects all of us. It started with removal policies and forced assimilation through the boarding schools. Then it was allotment. Then it was child removal through the Indian Adoption Project. We see the effects today with the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people. Horrific rates of violence against children and women and LGBTQ plus people in our communities. There's an urgency to this because we don't want another generation of children in Indian country to live their entire lives with that burden. So we don't just hear the urgency in your voice when you meet with us to talk about your people and your communities. We feel it. We feel it. We're all now waiting for the Supreme Court to hand down its ruling in the Brackeen case on the Indian Child Welfare Act. Most people in this room know that ICWA was adopted to end and repudiate the era of child removal and forced assimilation. And with the Self-Determination Act and ICWA, those laws marked a turning point for the United States. It signaled a national, bipartisan policy commitment to protect the existence of Indian tribes, support tribal sovereignty, and protect Indian families. That's our trust responsibility. That's our trust responsibility to every tribe and every single American Indian and Alaska Native person in the United States. And President Biden and his entire administration is unwavering in our work to continue to defend that commitment and to defend the Indian Child Welfare Act. And we're going to do it in a way that matches your commitment to your people and your communities and your urgency. So I want to thank you all again for the work that you do on behalf of your people in your communities and for your partnership with us. And I want to thank you on behalf of all of us at the Department of the Interior for your support and your prayers so far through this effort. It's been a lot of fun, and I look forward to continuing this work into the future. Miigwech, thank you.
And we do have 5 more minutes for questions. I want to call on Chairwoman Maltese, and then gentleman here. Yes, Chairwoman, floor is yours. Chairwoman Andrews Maltese.
Thank you, and thank you very much for being here, Bryan. Really appreciate it, and all the work that the team is doing. It's really great to hear about the 105L leases going into mandatory funding. It's going to be critical for Indian country, and we're waiting very anxiously for the ICWA results, because we know this is just the latest attempt in genocide against our communities, and it did all begin to happen in the East when they started doing this long before the United States was organized, and it continues to today. So after 400 years, we're still fighting the battle of keeping our children, our culture, and our future with us, and it's sad that we're in this position, but appreciate the work and support. My main question is with the clawback for the Department of the Interior. I believe they listed $56 million in the operation of Indian programs that are going to be taken back due to unexpenditures. And I was wondering what the department is planning on, and or what we can do in Indian country as tribal leadership to help keep us harmless from this clawback. We're grossly underfunded as it is, and then just because we've been the recipients of funding, that with our reserve and the way we plan for the future, and maybe not just burning that money as other federal agencies do, we need to make sure that we can protect this $56 million that's a direct clawback, as well as the other clawbacks through the other partner agencies that might be an indirect retrieval or recouping of the funding that the new bill is going to take.
Thank you, Chairwoman. So I think you're referring to the recent default debt limit bill. So that number is actually much lower than 56 million. And I'm really, I don't have the precise number of dollars on the in the front of my mind at the moment, but I'm really proud of our team at BIA that they were able to obligate all but I think the final number was less than 0.5% of our funding in BIA under ARPA. So we were able to move almost all of that money out to Indian country, and I believe the final number is much, much lower than the number you cited here. I think that was the last projection several weeks ago as those conversations were happening. But the final number is much lower, and we've been working hard to make sure that all these funds get out to where they're needed, really, which is to all of you and the work you're doing in your communities.
All right, and we have one more question. We got 2 minutes. Floor is yours. 2 minutes.
I'm just going to say, Brian, I appreciate you being here today and the discussion about taking lands into trust. Isaiah Vivanco, Chairman for Saboba Band of Luiseño Indians in California. I was wondering if you can offer any kind of timeline on when the new regulations for taking land into trust may be published. Thank
you, Chairman. Our goal has always been to complete these regulations this year, and we're on track to do that. The mechanics of how the documents and files get moved through that process. Sometimes it really depends on where we are in the queue, but we are well on pace to finalize those regulations this year. And I will add on top of that, when I say this year, I don't think, or I'm not saying December 31st. I mean, we're gonna get these regs into effect this year, and we want to be able to use these new regs. We want you to be able to use these new regs with us. So, Miigwech, thank you.
1 minute. What?
Yes, sir. Chief Sachem Stanton from the Narragansett Indian Tribe. I'd like to thank yourself and for Deb Helen for doing a tremendous job, and I will give you that respect and recognition. As we have discussed many times in the past, sir, my tribe needs through 18 U.S.C. 1150, 1151 Indian country jurisdiction. We've been trying now for many years to have the restrictive settlement acts removed and gain full reservation status. You know where I stand. You know what I'm talking about. My tribe has suffered now for 40 years. We need action immediately. And briefly, I'll explain why. With the CARES Act money being used up, rescue plan money being used up, we're going to have to resort back to our 2018 level of funding. Our tribal rolls have now tripled, with the understanding we'll have less money as times get tougher. With full reservation status, it might open some business opportunities for us, and we need an answer.
Thank you, Chief. I've enjoyed meeting with you and also some of your colleagues from other Northeast tribes on these issues. I know we met, I think our last meeting was late at the end of last year on this topic. Happy to continue to work with you all. I think your legal teams have been in touch with us, but just as a general issue, we know that those settlement acts put your tribe and other tribes along the East Coast in a very different position from many of the tribes here today, and I appreciate your advocacy on that. So I want to, just before I walk off the stage, just one last thing. I want to say, Miigwech, thank you to all of you again. All of us on our team, we're tribal members too. Some of us are your constituents, and we appreciate the work you all do every day, your tireless advocacy. We know that you're every bit as stressed, and so I want to offer our prayers for you and your families, for the sacrifices you're making to advance the work in your communities and to make life better for your people. I'm so grateful to work with you and learn from you. Chi Miigwech.